I'm Maxine Crump. I'm with Dialogue on Race Louisiana, an organization that housed the core program, the Dialogue on Race original series. It is the series where the conversations are in an educational process where people get to have a way of talking about race, backed by factual material and led by facilitators. One of the longest serving facilitators with Dialogue on Race is Bobby Thompson, and he's here with me today, and we're going to have a conversation, not just about him serving, but can you imagine if Bobby Thompson has served for more than 20 years with Dialogue on Race Louisiana. Now, the organization is 10 years old, but we started doing the work of Dialogue on Race decades before. Mm-hmm. And in all that time, he's the person I should be talking to about race. He's heard a lot. And I want to have an opportunity to learn, to let you hear about Bobby as well. So welcome, Bobby.
Well, thank you, Maxine. It's a pleasure, and it has been a long run.
Yes, and I want to thank you so much for your service with Dialogue on Race.
Sure.
It has been, you have been a staple for so many of the other facilitators. They have learned from you and how to facilitate and how to have these conversations. And what they've been most amazed about is how you, in all of the experiences you've had, because you're a baby boomer, so you grew up in Jim Crow. And many of them who are facilitating today, they did not grow up in Jim Crow.
That's
and
right.
So they can't imagine how you can be so solid and so compassionate and stable as you listen to people in these conversations and to facilitate them unpacking the false and flawed narrative around race.
Let me tell you a story, Maxine. When I first went in the Marine Corps, I met a guy named James Harris. And when I first met him, he asked me, what was I reading? And he told me that you'll never experience enough to know what you need to know to move forward in your life. And first book he gave me was Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver. And from that point on, I realized Eldridge was just a regular guy. Of course, he was being hounded by the police, and he was in jail when he wrote that book. But what it said to me is that he was a regular guy, and he was just talking about his life. So, and I was dyslexic. I still am. So reading comes difficult for me. So I decided if I was going to read, what I wanted to learn was two things. I wanted to learn, why is there racism, and why do people believe anything? So since 1968, I've been studying, why is there racism? And then I met Maxine and the Dialogue and Robbie Madden, and boy, have I learned a lot since then.
Yes, and you have applied the things you've learned through reading and your experiences.
Yes, absolutely.
And those who hear about racism today and read about it, they have different come-froms depending on where they're coming from.
Exactly.
In fact, I have met black people who says, I've never experienced racism.
Yes.
Well, since you're not one of those, and I'm not one of those,
right?
And I don't believe that they're one of those.
Right,
I know they're not.
Right.
But for some reason, they think they're not. So a lot of people who come in the Dialogue, they know there's racism.
Right.
Most of them.
Right.
But they don't know some of the details. And you were telling me an experience, and what I love what you said about it is the experience that happens to one person in the family affects the whole family.
The whole family.
Now,
exactly.
We're living in an environment where these experiences are real. Would you relate the story to me of your brother's birth?
Yeah. My brother is a year older than me, so this would have been 1946. And he was born in Our Lady of the Lake Hospital, which is one of the biggest hospitals here in Baton Rouge. And there were no doctors allowed to practice in the hospital. So even though my mom had her prenatal work done by black doctors, when it came to time to have her baby, she would have to have him delivered by a white doctor in Our Lady of the Lake Hospital. So she was delivered, and this is the story I got. She was delivered by an Italian doctor, My brother's name is Helvius Lewis Calvert Thompson Jr. Okay, he was known all his life by Tony, and that's because an Italian doctor delivered him. And when he pulled Tony up, he said, "Oh, look at this little Tony."
Wow.
So, so he's been known for Tony as Tony all his life, but it goes back to that institutional ruling that my mom could not have her personal doctor deliver her baby.
A black man still had no rights in which a white man had to respect.
Respect, exactly.
And it was institutionally supported.
Absolutely.
That's the part that surprises people.
Yeah.
That it's
Yeah.
institutionally supported.
Exactly.
And how can they be surprised when this country has been set up this way from the founding?
From the founding, absolutely.
Because it has become normative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Talk about some of the other experiences. You mentioned growing up in Jim Crow,
Mm-hmm.
that you end up having your childhood eclipsed
Mm-hmm.
as
Mm-hmm.
as a space where children
Mm-hmm.
can roam
Mm-hmm.
free in their childhood.
Exactly.
But when your whole society, or when the setup of your society sanctions and limit your access,
Right.
it has a different effect on you.
Right.
Talk about some of those experiences.
The one that really sticks out to me is, and how I really learned about racism. I knew that white people got certain privileges that black people didn't have, and I noticed their, where they lived and they drove cars. But my family didn't have a car. I mean, my family did have a car, so I never got to ride the bus. But this particular time, and this goes back to my brother and me being born at Our Lady of the Lake in a segregated hospital. Mom didn't want to go through that again. So she did all her prenatal care in New Orleans, Flint Goodrich Hospital, run by black people for black people. So at one point, and I was about 9 at the time, she was pregnant with my sister. And so she was getting her prenatal care in New Orleans. And one particular time she was going to go to New Orleans. I was still in school, finishing that year. And I didn't want to go to New Orleans with her. My brother went, and, of course, my dad drove him. So they set up a situation where my great-uncle would ride the bus over to I went to Berean Seventh-day Adventist School. On South 14th, and so he would ride over there, and we would catch the bus on South 13th, and my grandmother lived on North Street. So because I never rode the bus, I was fascinated by the bus driver and the big steering wheel, and so when we got on the bus, my uncle paid the money, and I jumped on the seat right behind the bus driver. The bus driver never said a word. And my uncle, I could see him waving for me to come in the back. And, of course, being a kid, I just ignored him. I just turned my head like I didn't see it.
Yeah, you had the best seat in the house.
Right, exactly. So we rode, and I was just loving riding behind the bus driver and watching him do the thing. When we got to our stop in front of my grandmother's house, my uncle pulled the chain, and, he motioned for me to come and get off the bus with him. But I didn't go out the back door. Both doors open, and I started out the front door. And just as I was about to step out the door, the bus driver slammed the door. In those days, they had those accordion-type doors.
Yes.
Well, it caught me halfway in and halfway out of the bus, and he drove off. So, I was terrified. I could hear the people on the bus screaming, for him to stop. And I could see the trees and stuff going by, and I didn't know what the heck was going on. Finally, after about a block, the bus driver slammed on his brakes, opened the door. I fell out on the ground, and I'll never forget that face. He was so angry, and I could not figure out why he was so angry. And, of course, being a kid, I figured out there was something I did.
Sure.
And so I ran back down to my grandmother's house. My uncle was just totally distraught. But it just shows you how my grandmother, I can remember her, taking me. She didn't hug me or anything. She just looked at me and checked me out. And she said, okay, he's okay. But she did call my Uncle Doopy. And he came out. And I can remember seeing him talking to a police officer. out in front of the house, and then they left. And he came in the house, and he looked at me, and he said he's okay. And I was okay. I went in.
Depends on what you call okay.
Okay. Exactly.
Now, how old were you then?
I was 9. I think I was 9. Yeah, because my sister is 7 years younger than me.
And he saw it as a personal affront from a 9-year-old.
From a 9-year-old. Well, you have to remember the Montgomery bus boycott happened in 1955.
Right.
So this has been 1956.
Yes, and so the bus boycott had already happened in Baton Rouge.
And Baton Rouge was 1953.
53.
Yeah.
54.
54. And
no, it was 53. You're right, 53. And people thought that had solved something. So what did it solve?
It really didn't solve anything. And the people of Baton Rouge really got behind the boycott. It was one of those proud moments in Baton Rouge where we had the private people picking up, riding people to their jobs. And
it was an amazing sacrifice that people made. They would go to work dressed.
Absolutely.
If they had to walk, they still walked dressed.
Exactly.
When they would ride share, it was hot. It was in the summer
exactly.
when they were doing this.
And a minister, Jemison, made a deal with the bus company they would allow the seating on the bus to remain as it was. In other words, the white section would remain white, so that if it filled up, they couldn't go to the black section and make a black person get up and take their seat. And the black section would remain black, and if it filled up, they would just have to stand up. Well, I mean, that's the way it was before.
That's the way it was before.
Yeah.
So not much change.
Not much change.
But the action of it and the fact that it got as far as it got, and they saw this activism, brought Dr. King to come and find out what he could learn from it.
Exactly.
And I guess he learned he wasn't going to let that happen.
Right. But I can remember my Uncle Doopy and a lot of the black leaders were very upset about that
about them ending it right there, that compromise.
Right. Because at the meeting, everybody wanted to keep going.
Sure.
They wanted to keep going. And so I can imagine this bus driver, and white people see kids as grown. They don't see kids as kids. So they didn't see me as a 9-year-old. I realize that now, but back then, I thought I was going to get a whipping.
Yeah. And you said they didn't see kids as kids, but when a kid did something like that, they thought somebody needed to punish that
Punish
kid.
him.
Because he needs to know his place early.
That's it.
Knowing his place. And you said that affects a childhood, and that also affects the rest of the family and the rest of your life. What kinds of effects do you see? Because you were just one black kid who experienced that sort of thing.
Right. Jim Crow didn't end in 1964. It continues on to this day. The legacies, and this is something we need to be vigilant about. The legacy of these things do not die. They morph into something else, I can remember when segregation was made illegal, and they were trying to integrate the schools. Well, my Uncle Doopy again was on the biracial committee, they called it,
for the city,
mm-hmm. And they were talking about how to integrate the schools. Well, the white people who were in the majority demanded that they start at the higher grades, which my uncle knew that was going to be a problem. If you did it with kindergarten kids and go up, you had a better chance of it being successful. Mm-hmm. So he knew right off the bat that this was an effort to sabotage the effort to integrate the schools.
Right. So passing the law of desegregation, saying it ends race discrimination here. No more segregation.
Right.
Where was the enforcement?
Right.
That's what was lacking. No enforcement.
Right.
And so institutions stood back and said, well, that's people.
Exactly. And you hear that a lot today. You hear the individualization of racism. And, people say, well, I'm not racist. Well, you don't have to be. You got a whole institutional government and economic system that takes care of that for you.
Exactly. So the law passed. It stated things, but without enforcement, it might as well not even had been a law.
Right.
Because what the law did was it helped white businesses, for example, because people who who were refused service, who were black, now white businesses could let you in because they had a law that gave them cover. Said, look, I got to do it. It's the law.
Right.
They could use the law.
Right.
But black people couldn't use the law unless they filed a lawsuit.
That's exactly right. And what did
Something
Dr.
wrong
King,
with that.
Dr. King said integrating the lunch counters didn't cost you a dime. Matter of fact, it made you money. Being able to go into, integrating anywhere didn't really cost you anything. But looking at the economic system would have been something different.
It would have been, because it would have been looking at it so that you could take action, because race was always economics.
Right.
When you think about, and a lot of people don't think about the fact that the economy was built on race.
Right.
So once there was this enslavement, it started in 1619, and they started to build the economy, that's when the settlers saw that they could fight to have a nation, because they saw they could build an economy with forced free black labor and stolen land, takeover of land from the natives.
Right.
And so then when you're talking about coming up with a charter for this nation, you have to decide who's a citizen.
Exactly.
And when you say, well, we're not going to include these as citizens, we're not going to include these as citizens, you have begun to set up a race structure.
Exactly. And if it is based on forced labor, I mean, how is that different from, say, Nazi Germany that forced Jews to work till they died?
Yes, it's not different. It's as horrifying, and yet in this country, Germany is described for its horrifying actions.
Exactly.
And slavery has a benevolent appearance to it, a really romanticized appearance. Because the statements are still made. Well, they fed them and they housed them. They didn't burn them in the furnace. So why would you burn your income source in the furnace? Of course you didn't burn it. It wasn't that. It wasn't that that they wanted to be rid of them. It's wanted to control them and own them and get free labor and build an economy, and then not allow them to be a part of it.
Imagine if any major company in America could have free labor for the life of their country. I mean, your labor cost is your number one expenditure in any corporation. If you could wipe that off the books, my goodness. And they had 400 years of no labor costs.
Well, not 400 years of no labor costs, but for the time of the enslavement, yes, no labor costs. And then shortly afterward, the sharecropping was another level of almost no labor cost because of the way that was done. It stole from those who were sharecropping with them. There's so many horror stories until after a while people say it couldn't have been that bad. And it's like once a person reached their saturation point for believing that, then another part of that story is, well, that was in the South.
I can tell you Los Angeles, California, Orange County. After my time in Vietnam, a couple other Marines and myself rented an apartment in a really nice neighborhood. I know I had to show my key to a police officer at least 3 times that I lived there, to prove that I lived there.
Being a soldier, fighting for your country.
Right.
The police officers. Supposedly serving the citizens. Didn't trust you. Right.
So yeah, I mean that I grew up thinking California was the paradise, I went to jail.
At least it wasn't Jim Crow.
At least
but you went to jail in
I went to jail in California
for
cracked taillight lens.
Cracked taillight.
For 4 days.
Still goes on. 4 days.
For 4 days. And the thing about it was when I saw the cop, I knew what was going to happen. I knew they were predators, and I knew they were going to get me. But,
you knew they were predators. and your country did nothing about that.
And again, I'm an ex-Marine.
Yeah.
I've been to Vietnam.
And that's the power of what dialogue is about. It does not allow it to just be police officers or a bad cop. That was not a bad apple.
No,
that was sanctioned.
It wasn't. It was. I mean, the whole structure of the L.A. Police Department, from the time that cop picked me up, the time I went through the prison system, it was a nightmare, and I was treated like a common criminal.
Or for a broken tail
For a
light.
broken tail light.
That could happen to anybody. A broken tail light.
Yeah. I mean, we see it today.
Mm-hmm.
We see it today. And how often Carlos Harris, I try to raise his name every time I get a chance. Young man here in Baton Rouge was killed because he was told to move a friend's car who had problems with the steering wheel. He told the police officer, "I'm too drunk to drive." I mean, he tried to drive the car. The steering wheel was broken to start with, so his erratic driving caused this cop to shoot him dead. The city paid $500,000.
Who told him to drive? And the guy says, "I'm too drunk to drive."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we don't hear about him. That's
no,
why.
We don't. Never heard that story. Was it ever printed anywhere?
It had a backstory, back page story. Yeah, you can look him up.
Well.
Yeah, $500,000 the city paid for that. That's
eventually.
Yeah, eventually.
Not right away.
And of course, the cop got no.
He stayed on the force.
Exactly.
Something's wrong with that. That's not a bad apple. That's bad stuff going on in the system.
Absolutely.
And this has become all too normal. And yet, people say, "Well, look at Michael Jordan.
Right.
Look at Oprah Winfrey.
Right.
They did it. Right. They're doing good. If they can make it, anybody can." That's the wrong story, isn't it?
That's the wrong story. I worked in as a letter carrier. I worked in a quote unquote high crime, low income area, and the first thing I noticed was these are hardworking people. 2 jobs, both parents working their butts off, trying to keep the kids out of trouble, trying to get them educated at a school that looks like a prison to start with. The police ride through the neighborhood like it's a war zone, and you watch the neighborhood go from being okay to being nothing. All the infrastructure, totally divested of anything. No grocery store within a
So
walking
that's an
distance.
important point you make. You watch the neighborhood go down, and I'm hearing you describe resources leaving the community. Why?
Yeah.
People say it's the people who live in the community.
Right.
Statistics show it was white flight.
It was white flight.
When the resources is taken out of a community, and the community is not free to move, does not have the same access, does not have the same opportunity.
Right.
How do you miss that and go straight to the people as the problem?
Yes.
It's a flawed narrative.
Right.
And the narrative seems to be the strongest part of this story, because one narrative that's not in this story is that how the North became enriched, and they don't connect it to the industrialization of the North, that the first commodity was cotton that industrialized the North, which made the banks and the businesses in the North wealthy. This whole country benefited from cotton and the enslaved people. Yeah. And now lazy is a term. And low morals given to describe communities of color. It just using the zip code tells you, that's a bad community. Mm-hmm. Going into the store where there are barriers to certain products, and you ask, well, why do I have to get someone to get a key to get me this kind of product? And they say, well, the neighborhood. And that makes sense to other people.
Yeah, it does. It does.
What do we need to know, Bobby? What do we need to know?
Oh, boy. What we need to know is that racism is not about hatred. It's not personal. it's the institutions that set up. Who was that? I heard somebody. Oh, it was one of the rappers said how America creates a 3-car on ramp to failure and no ramp to success.
Wow. But you know what? I'm not going to, we're going to come to a close, but I'm not going to leave it there because I want to say that if people knew you, that all you're describing is just a fingernail.
Oh, yeah.
And that's not even a lot of your experience. You've had so much more of that. Even coming back to Baton Rouge from the military and coming back at the time when there was supposedly a Baton Rouge called riot.
Right. Walked right in the middle of it.
Yeah.
Had no idea what was going on. And it was such a shock to me. I had just gotten back from Vietnam. And to walk into that situation was just mind-blowing. I could not believe this was happening in Baton Rouge.
And
4 people died.
Yeah. And the description it got in the news stories it got left it as still completely not fully solved, not a full clear story yet. And that was in 71, 72?
72, January 11th, 72. I remember that because that was my oldest son's birthday.
And it frightened Baton Rouge so that whole area became totally changed.
I think it's so symbolic. I think it's so symbolic they put a bridge over that area.
Put a bridge over that area.
So you don't even have to go by there. Don't have to see it. Don't have to think about it.
Don't have to look at it.
Right.
That's what you can do with the power of a system that allows for institutions to carry out that kind of power.
Exactly.
And yet people wouldn't know that you're a pretty cool guy. You're considered really cool. You have learned to live your life through that. You know music. You love music. I love to watch you at a jazz show. You go to a jazz festival every year.
Yeah.
You've lived well anyway. And some people think that makes it okay.
Yeah.
And you have a wonderful family and a beautiful wife.
Yes. I mean, all that makes it okay for sure. But I have kids. I have 4 kids. And that is a parent's nightmare. To know that you could lose your child.
And you had encounters where you had to worry about your child.
Oh, yeah.
And the racist system.
And the racist system, yeah. And it's tough because you want your kid to have a childhood. You want your kid to have a normal childhood, you know. One thing I've noticed, I listen to my white friends talk about their childhood. And it is so much about we went here, we went there. I traveled with my family to this place. We were on the beach. And I'm going, wow, what freedom you have to just move around.
And the people that are being blocked are also American citizens with the same rights on the books. But who's assuring those rights?
Right.
Is that what needs to happen?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, this isn't going to be your last time being here. We're going to do this again because there's so much more I want you to talk about.
Sure.
But I think you've given such a view of race and experience of being a baby boomer and living through Jim Crow and doing the work of these conversations. I want to have you back when you can talk about some of the conversations that you experienced in dialogue. So we're going to do that again soon.
Okay.
Because you do the kinds of things that help people who didn't think they could have this conversation to help them have it. Right. And that is such a value.
Sure.
People are very afraid to talk about race.
Right.
But you are able to do it in a way that opens them up to talk.
It's not personal. People want to get rid of the hate, and it's not about hate. It's not personal. You were set up to see things this way. Just like I was set up to live in the world I live in. I didn't create it.
And they need to have that same knowledge on that side of the understanding.
Absolutely.
Those who are white, who've been kept from knowing that,
right,
are able to get to it in dialogue.
Yes.
Particularly if you're facilitating.
Thank you.
Bobby, thank you so much.
Thank you, Maxine.
All my love.
It's a pleasure. Yes.